Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has launched what U.S. officials describe as the most significant military action in Europe in 77 years. From the north, the east, and the south, Russia has attacked Ukraine with airstrikes, missiles, and troops. Ukraine says that at least 57 people have been killed and 170 wounded. Elements of the Russian army, one of the largest in the world, are heading toward Kyiv, the capital. And the U.S. fears the goal is to take over the country and evict the government. Nick Schifrin begins our coverage.
In a European capital, the full weight of the Russian military. What the U.S. calls the initial phase of a full-scale invasion, with Russian helicopters flying low over residential rooftops and to the outskirts of Kyiv to seize a military airport. Military vehicles pouring into southern Ukraine, and Russian troops taking over the Chernobyl nuclear site on their way to sack the capital. Ukraine and the U.S. say the Russian military is advancing on at least 3 axes, from Belarus in a pincer movement toward Kyiv, from the south and Russian-occupied Crimea, and from the east into the country's second-largest city, Kharkiv, where the war entered living rooms. This is an unexploded rocket and the aftermath of a direct hit on a residential complex. In this city of 1.4 million, the only safe place was the subway, where children distract themselves as their parents fear for the future and loved ones hold on tight.
It's normal people who don't want war, who suffer. We want to live in peace, to go to work, build our families, develop our country. We just want a peaceful sky over our heads, instead of hiding as rats in holes.
But the vast majority of targets Ukraine's military. A senior U.S. defense official says more than 160 Russian missiles launched from the air, sea, and from inside Russia punished Ukraine's bases, airfields, and air defenses. It sparked an exodus. Cars filled Kyiv streets with families fleeing west away from the invasion. The highway out of town, complete gridlock. 29-year-old Oksana Matiash stopped at a gas station to tell us how she felt.
One of the news media that I checked, there was a huge headline that Putin started war in Ukraine. I think that was the fastest in my life that I needed to pack my things. And I just took my hoodie, one sweater, one pair of jeans, my computer, and that's it. All of my belongings are left in Kyiv. It's really scary, but I do believe in Ukraine, in its leadership, in our armed forces.
But in Mariupol, an industrial city near the coast, others had nowhere to go.
I'm alone at work. Where will I run? Where do I go? Tell me, please. My God.
And today is just day one. Russia has kept in reserve the vast majority of the more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's border who are waiting, posing for cameras, and poised to further invade.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
At the White House today, President Biden unveiled sanctions designed to punish Russia long term. The U.S. has now blocked the assets of all of Russia's largest banks, including the largest, Sberbank. The U.S. sanctioned Russian oligarchs who have, quote, enriched themselves at the expense of the Russian state. And the U.S. banned exports of technology with any American intellectual property, including semiconductors used in cars, smartphones, and missiles.
We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy.
President Biden warned again that gas prices could rise and urged oil companies not to exploit global instability.
My administration is using every tool at its disposal to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption.
American sanction timed with European export controls, announced by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Our measures will weaken Russia's technological position in key areas, actually from which the elite makes most of their money. And this ranges from high-tech components to cutting-edge software. This will also seriously degrade the Russian economy in all areas in the future.
And the United Kingdom introduced new restrictions on wealthy Russians' access to British banks. It banned Aeroflot from British airspace and is working to exclude Russia from the SWIFT financial system. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands.
And the West fears Putin could expand the conflict into NATO. So the U.S. announced today it sent 7,000 members of an armored brigade combat team to Germany, in addition to F-35s and Apache helicopters arriving today along NATO's eastern flank. And the 3,000 additional soldiers recently sent to Poland. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
We have increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance with thousands of more troops, ships and planes over the last weeks. To send a very clear message that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance. And we do so not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict.
Inside Russia, Putin is preventing protest. Moscow police arrested hundreds of demonstrators calling for an end to a war that Putin said was to, quote, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, even though President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish and his great-uncles died in the Holocaust. Last night, Putin also obliquely threatened nuclear war.
Whoever would try to stop us and further create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead you to such consequences that you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome.
Despite it all, today Zelensky offered diplomacy.
We underline that it wasn't Ukraine who chose the path of war, but Ukraine is offering to get back to the path of peace.
And Ukrainians are offering something else. In the face of invasion, hundreds lined up outside a hospital to show their resilience and donate their blood.
And tonight, President Zelensky has ordered a general mobilization of all citizens in Ukraine in response to the Russian invasion.
The battle for the capital city of Kyiv appears to be underway, with Russian missile and airstrikes on the city and reports of pitched fighting on its outskirts. Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke tonight and told the people of Kyiv to prepare for the storming of the city by Russian forces. This as fighting continues in the central, southern, and eastern reaches of the country. And this evening, President Biden requested that Congress fund $6.4 billion in humanitarian aid and defense aid for Ukraine. Again tonight, Nick Schifrin begins our coverage.
It has been 81 years since the world witnessed this. Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million, under large-scale attack for the first time since it was sacked by Nazi Germany. This apartment complex hit not by a Russian missile, but by the remains of a Russian plane shot down by Ukrainian defenses. And as sirens blare above, exhausted families filled metro stations that double as bomb shelters. They fled their homes with only what they could carry, including furry friends and the prized possessions that help a people under siege maintain their spirits. As is Ukraine's military. It shot down this Russian aircraft, and a senior U.S. defense official says Russia is, quote, not advancing as far or as fast as they believe they would be. Ukrainian military command and control remains intact. And President Volodymyr Zelensky hit the streets and social media to urge defiance.
We defend our independence. That's how it'll go. Glory to our defenders, both male and female. Glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
But all is not well on the southern front. Russian troops leaving occupied Crimea are pouring in, captured on a CCTV camera before a soldier climbed a pole to point the camera down. A senior U.S. official says Russian troops in the south are advancing past Kherson and splitting off and heading toward Mariupol. In Kakhovka, Russian forces are battling for a dam and power plant. On the Sea of Azov, thousands of Russian troops are coming ashore, and Russia continues its assaults toward Kyiv and, in the east, on Kharkiv, where journalists took cover in drainage pipes and military vehicles were left smoldering. For many Ukrainians, it's all gotten too much. Soldiers had to fire warning shots at Kyiv's train station. Thousands are trying to flee. Families who make it to Romania's border have to split up. Ukraine blocked 18 to 60-year-old men from leaving. Juliana is from Western Ukraine.
We don't believe Putin, and we have our daughter, so we are afraid.
Alana from Kyiv.
There are lots of fights, so that's awful. There are nothing good there. Just blood, ruins, and all of the wars that war can bring with it.
War has also brought Russia economic punishment. Today, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki announced the U.S. is sanctioning Russian President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
What we are hoping the world takes away from this is the unity through which the United States, President Biden, is working with our European partners and allies.
The European Union and United Kingdom today did the same. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock.
Today we answer with an absolutely clear message. This will drive Russia to ruin.
There's a full-fledged invasion of a partner, a country that borders several NATO allied countries.
For the first time today, NATO activated its response force, which allows up to 40,000 additional NATO troops to bolster the eastern flank. NATO allies worry any conflict in Ukraine could spread to the rest of Europe. Today, American F-35s landed in Romania, and the first of more than 300 American soldiers arrived yesterday in Latvia. Despite it all, today Zelensky, speaking in Russian, offered diplomacy.
I'd like to address the Russian president again. Fighting is going on the entire territory of Ukraine. Let's sit down for talks to put a stop to people dying.
Russian officials responded with mixed messages, but Foreign Minister Lavrov said Russia's goals remain maximalist.
Russia will provide the demilitarization of Ukraine. Russia will provide the denazification of Ukraine.
But these Russians want nothing of the sort. For the second straight day, thousands protested. And for the second straight day, police shut it down. Independent researchers say authorities detained hundreds in more than 24 cities. In Washington today, Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, urged the West to impose stronger sanctions and send more weapons.
We would like, together with our friends, allies, and partners, and definitely together with all of our armed forces, to get there faster, so we are not losing the bravest and the best that we have.
But some of Ukraine's bravest have already fallen. This soldier live-streamed an attack. He and 12 fellow soldiers died guarding Snake Island off Ukraine's coast. Back in the capital, at the epicenter of today's destruction, Kyiv residents cleaned up. This is only day 2, and they fear what's to come. But for now, they sing Ukraine's national anthem, ending with "Long live Ukraine." For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
In less than a week since Russia began its attack on Ukraine, more than 500,000 Ukrainians have fled their nation and are now refugees. This comes as the U.S. and Europe imposed harsh new sanctions on the Russian central bank, sending the ruble crashing and interest rates soaring. Elsewhere, the International Criminal Court in the Netherlands said that it would open an investigation into possible war crimes in Ukraine. And the U.S. says that it will expel 12 Russian diplomats at the United Nations for alleged activities outside their diplomatic roles. Back in Ukraine, the fighting and the fleeing continues. Nick Schifrin is now on the ground there, reporting tonight from Lviv. And a warning, images in this story may disturb some viewers.
There is no safe way to flee a war. Thousands of Ukrainians pressed into the closest train station to Poland. Their journey one way, their future uncertain. 22-year-old Yulia is a computer programmer from Kyiv.
I heard a lot of bangs and some support.
And how long will you leave for?
I don't know, it depends on how long the war will be.
Ukrainian men aren't allowed to escape the war. The border's only open to women and children. Children too young to understand, old enough to share their parents' fear. But fathers saying goodbye don't know when their sons will come back. All they can hope is this is not farewell. A few miles away, the road to Poland is a traumatized population's escape corridor. 30,000 people fleeing in cars have created a line 20 miles long. Many chose to walk and pack their lives into single suitcases. They don't care that evacuation can take days. The only reason families make children flee is because it's too dangerous to stay home.
I won't leave them here, because you know what Russians do when they attack? They bomb everything. They don't care. We can't leave them here.
Ivan Svestin has been in line for 27 hours. Inside his van, his daughter and her kids, his grandchildren.
My plan is to take them to the border, make sure they cross to Poland, and I will go back and fight. I will defend Ukraine against Putin.
Svetlana and her son fled near the Belarus border 24 hours ago.
I think everyone is scared because we don't know what will be tomorrow, what will be in 2 hours, and where we will see Russian helicopters.
Margarita and her son's home in Odessa was bombed. She had to pack in 1 hour.
I'm forced to flee abroad with my kids. It's very painful. I don't have the words.
It's about 35 degrees, so locals from a nearby town provide provisions. This comfort station is set up by the local church, but sometimes the volunteers are also the displaced. Sophia fled her home in Kyiv. She worries as much about her country as her cross-border family and friendships.
My heart is breaking, and it's awful that our friends in Russia support the war.
This is the awful reality of Putin's war. A 6-year-old girl rushed to the hospital after she was hit by Russian shells. The medical staff powerless to save her, one of 16 children killed in 5 days.
Show this to Putin, the eyes of this child, and crying doctors.
A senior U.S. defense official today said Russian troops' advances are not as rapid as expected, but the official feared the Russians would encircle Kyiv in a matter of days, and the assault continues on Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, where this weekend Russian convoys rolled into the city's center, and a Russian bomb hit an apartment complex. Officials say dozens of civilians were killed and more than 40 injured. Ukraine said its forces emerged victorious. Russian forces also suffered more losses outside of Kyiv, but new satellite images show a large convoy headed toward the capital. Meanwhile, for the first time since the invasion, a Ukrainian delegation traveled to meet Russian counterparts. Both sides said the initial talks remain inconclusive. As for the country's leaders, today Russia's President Vladimir Putin met his economic advisors at a distance, 1 day after he increased the alert level of Russia's nuclear forces, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rallied his nation.
When I ran for president, I said each of us is the president, because we are all responsible for our state. It turns out each of us is a warrior in their own way, and I am confident that each of us will win.
Which has led to a national grassroots mobilization. In downtown Lviv, they're making the most basic of weapons. Nazar used to be a brewer at this brewery named Truth. He's now mixing Molotov cocktails, named after a Russian foreign minister known for disinformation.
I highly doubt that something will happen in downtown Lviv, but we should have something to defend ourselves. And this is the only way to defend ourselves, because this is something that every Ukrainian can create.
Yuri Zastavny is the brewery's owner. He calls himself a veteran of previous Ukrainian revolutions. 1991, when Ukraine became independent. 2014, when they also threw Molotov cocktails and evicted a pro-Russian government. And now they'll send their craft weapons to Kyiv.
I think everybody understands this is nothing to do with business. This is something to do with securing your free future. If you don't do this, if we as a country don't do this, there is no future.
Ukraine is being tested perhaps as never before. But this is a country of faith, and inside this Greek Catholic church, despite national anxiety, the priests said their faith was their armor.
The enemy is attacking us, but we are with God. And if we are with God, who can be against us?
And when the choir started, it wasn't a solemn song. They sang a call to arms, a battle hymn for Ukraine.
Russian citizens by the thousands are protesting the war in Ukraine at great personal risk to themselves as the Putin government cracks down on all kinds of dissent. Special correspondent Ryan Chilcote reports from Moscow.
From Yekaterinburg to St. Petersburg to the capital, Moscow, thousands of Russians across the country sharing one chant, one voice, spilling into streets and city squares, outraged ever since President Vladimir Putin last week ordered a full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine.
War must be stopped. It must be. It's crazy what's going on right now. We should all shout no to war.
Many protesters say they don't want to feel as if they have Ukrainian blood on their hands.
I don't want this war. Almost no one here wants it. I want the whole world to see that we don't want it. We don't want it to weigh on our conscience for decades. I don't want to feel guilty for living here through my whole life.
Many Russians see Ukrainians as their brothers and sisters. Plenty have family and friends there. Olga Maheva doesn't want Putin's assault to lead to both countries' destruction.
It is a crime, both against Ukraine and Russia. I think it is killing both Ukraine and Russia. I am outraged. I haven't slept for 3 nights, and I think we must now declare very loudly that we don't want to be killed and don't want Ukraine to be killed.
But as swiftly as Russians began to decry the conflict, so too came the armed police to strangle the dissent. One video on social media showed Russian security forces in St. Petersburg roughing up a woman holding a peace sign and a baby. Speaking out risked not only physical harm, but Russian authorities warned protesters could face criminal charges that could mark their records for life. An independent monitoring group reports that more than 6,000 demonstrators have been arrested. The crackdown also extended online to Facebook, as Russia's state communications regulator announced some restrictions on accessing the platform. But Facebook and other tech giants like Apple, Google, and Microsoft are flexing their muscle on Moscow, limiting the reach of Kremlin-controlled media outlets. And some prominent Russians have been calling for restraint in the war their country started. Oligarchs like billionaire Oleg Deripaska and steel baron Alexei Mordashov have called for peace. Sanctions are beginning to threaten the Russian economy. Comedian and popular talk show host Ivan Urgant posted a black square on Instagram captioned with "Fear and pain, no to war." The show was then taken off the air. The Russian TV station said removing it had nothing to do with his post. And last week, tennis star Andrei Rublev, ranked 7th in the world, wrote 3 words on a camera lens after winning a tournament match: "No war, please." Just a week prior, he'd won a doubles title with partner Denis Molchanov, a Ukrainian. As the condemnations, protests, and crackdowns continue, the Russians, not to mention Ukrainians, are not alone in their outrage. Demonstrations erupted around the world after Putin launched his assault. From the ancient city of Jerusalem to New York City, home of the largest Ukrainian population in the U.S., to Berlin, where more than 100,000 protesters made a show of force. As more and more countries rally around Ukraine, will Vladimir Putin bow to the international pressure? And inside Russia, how long will the dissent last, and how far is the Kremlin willing to go to drown it out? For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Ryan Chilcote in Moscow.
President Biden today announced a U.S. ban on all imports of Russian oil, a move followed quickly by the United Kingdom. The president said it would ratchet up the pressure on Russia's economy, which has come under withering pressure from sanctions and other moves by the U.S., European Union, and other nations.
We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. This is a move that has strong bipartisan support in the Congress and, I believe, in the country.
The torrent of companies leaving Russia continue today, too. American icons Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Starbucks, and McDonald's said they would suspend operations in Russia. McDonald's has more than 800 locations and employs tens of thousands of Russians. Meantime, leaders of U.S. intelligence agencies said today they believe President Putin underestimated the strength of Ukraine's resistance before launching the invasion nearly 2 weeks ago. They spoke during a congressional hearing on global threats to U.S. security. But Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines added that despite Russian setbacks, Putin may intensify his assault.
Our analysts assess that Putin is unlikely to be deterred by such setbacks and instead may escalate, essentially doubling down to achieve Ukrainian disarmament and neutrality to prevent it from further integrating with the U.S. and NATO if it doesn't reach some diplomatic negotiation.
Meantime, the war in Ukraine continues at a brutal pace. The United Nations Human Rights Agency said today that it has recorded 474 civilian deaths in the conflict, including 29 children. They believe the real toll is much higher. And the Pentagon today said that it believes somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 Russian troops have been killed in the fighting. Though they gave that estimate little confidence. The Ukrainians claim that they've killed 11,000 Russians. And now more than 2 million Ukrainians have fled their nation, including 1 million children, most heading west toward the rest of Europe. It is on part of that march where we find Nick Schifrin tonight in western Ukraine.
Today, finally, a rescue for families who've been living in fear, for hundreds of trapped foreign students, for residents of this northeast city besieged by Russian shelling. This is what they fled: the destruction of their homes, the fear of losing their lives in a Russian onslaught that clearly targeted civilians. The buses also headed to another corridor in the southeastern city Mariupol. But today, for the fourth straight day, there was no promised rescue nor Russian restraint. Residents have had no essentials for nearly a week. All they have is despair.
We don't have electricity. We don't have anything to eat. We don't have medicine. We have nothing.
The bombardment drives them underground. Babies barely older than the war. Parents so traumatized they can't offer comfort.
Why shouldn't I cry? I want my home. I want my job. I'm so sad about people, about the city, the children.
In Kharkiv, near the Russian border, a Russian bomb reduced a hospital to rubble. The World Health Organization said today at least 16 health facilities have been attacked in 12 days of war. But in a nearby hospital, a small miracle. A child named Vova survived, despite a piece of shrapnel in his skull. After surgery, when the doctor woke him up, Vova whispered, "I am fine." But there was no relief outside Kyiv in the suburb of Irpin. Residents who've been shelled for days braved Russian threats to cross under a destroyed bridge. A senior U.S. defense official today warned Russia is still advancing on the capital from the north, west, and northeast. Some of those fleeing in Irpin have lost homes for the second time in less than 2 weeks.
We've got nothing. We had to run away. At our house, the temperature was 10 degrees and it was decreasing. That's why we are fleeing again.
The flight to safety often as harrowing as the violence they escape. We met this family when they reached a safe space, a shelter near the Polish border. 6-year-old Nikita insisted on staying in his grandmother Olha's arms.
Can you tell me what it was like to make the decision to leave and how difficult it was to leave?
People got out of the bomb shelters all dirty and dust, and they got on the train. The people who got on the train, they were crying. And then the train station was being shelled, so we all had to wait.
To get to safety, they traveled through the Kharkiv train station, overwhelmed with people desperate to leave. They'd fled an area with constant explosions in the eastern district of Donetsk.
We were very close, and the kids were very scared. We were sitting in the bomb shelter all the time. The air raid alarm went off all the time. Both the kids would run into the bathroom, cover themselves with a blanket, and stay there the whole night. Our kids were prepared for that. They weren't too scared. Right now, when we call back home, there's no food in the grocery stores. People don't have money. And if they do, there's nothing to spend it on. Nothing.
The economy is a bit broken.
What's also broken? Russian military equipment. Ukraine said today it shot down 3 Russian fighter jets and a cruise missile. But in Moscow, President Putin raised pensions, a sign he may be worried about popular opinion, and claimed falsely all Russian troops in Ukraine were, quote, professional.
I'd like to emphasize that conscript soldiers do not and will not participate in the military operation, and there will be no additional call-out of reserves.
This war's far less formal commander-in-chief, despite death threats, showed off his office for the first time.
I stay here in Kyiv. I don't hide, and I'm not afraid of anyone. I will stay here as long as it's necessary to win in our patriotic war.
To win that war, Ukraine is lining up civilians and trying to turn them into warriors. Young men who feel at ease, older men willing to fight alongside their own children. They're called the Territorial Defense, volunteers who mostly never served or held a gun. Learning urban warfare as long as it takes. They take an oath to the military and country. They're just one unit of 100,000 across the country, Ukraine's newest weekday warriors, hardened not by battle, but by necessity.
What were you doing 2 weeks ago?
I'm an IT specialist. I'm chief marketing officer for a huge IT company.
30-year-old Eugene Lata is one of this unit's medics. Unlike most volunteers, he's seen combat. In 2014, he filmed and witnessed some of the worst fighting in eastern Ukraine. Now he prepares for more battle.
I believe the war will come to this because I don't believe that Putin will stop. He will not stop. We're just waiting. We're just waiting when the war will start in Odessa.
His job is to modernize the unit's medicine and outdated first aid kits.
1978, you know. But it's still okay. It's working.
So this is older than you.
Yeah, it's older than my mother.
Nearby, perhaps the youngest volunteer, Valeria Ruslanova is in charge of uniforms and is 19.
I am from Crimea. I came in 2018. I know what Russia is and what Putin is, and I don't wish any of that on Ukraine.
In 2014, Russian soldiers invaded Crimea. Moscow annexed the peninsula and persecuted or even killed anyone not deemed sufficiently pro-Russian.
These are young guys who are not afraid to say something. And then their bodies were found in the forest. They made us relinquish our Ukrainian passports and accept Russian citizenship. After, life in Crimea changed significantly. Crimea was destroyed. Most of the young people realized we did not have a future in Crimea.
Before the war, she says she hung out with her friends and was a barista. But her dreams of becoming a teacher now deferred.
In the future, I'd like to go back to school. But right now, I'm not thinking about that because we are thinking about protecting our Ukraine.
Do you have faith that you, the army, the government will be able to protect Odessa and protect the country?
I have no doubt whatsoever because no one expected that our people will stand up and fight, that we are so strong, that we are all united with one goal. And I have no doubt whatsoever.
Lada was born the same year an independent Ukraine was born, 1991. He's tied by birth to his country's fate.
Right now, everyone involved in every single city, in every single town of our country, everyone involved in this war. And people know and people understand that if we lose, then we don't have a country, then we don't have a nationality. And that's why we're fighting here, not for Odessa, not for the Kiev or Kharkiv. We are fighting for the whole Ukraine, and we are fighting for the independent country.
Ukraine gets much of its electricity from nuclear power, and a series of Russian military attacks near nuclear plants over the last 2 weeks are elevating fears of potential accidents and what they could trigger. John Yang has that.
Judy, the latest warnings come from Ukrainian authorities who say Russian attacks have left Chernobyl disconnected from the power grid. Chernobyl, as many know, is the site of the world's worst nuclear accident in 1986. And while it's no longer generating electricity, it still stores spent nuclear fuel, which must be cooled. There are emergency generators providing power to do that, but they run on diesel fuel and only had a 48-hour supply. And last week, a training area near another nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the largest one in Europe, briefly caught fire during a Russian assault. Science correspondent Miles O'Brien, who covered the aftermath of Chernobyl and other nuclear accidents, joins us now. Miles, the name Chernobyl, of course, haunts any discussion of nuclear power. What's the real threat of what's happening there now?
John, I think we have to put it in perspective. The nuclear fuel we're talking about there is old and cold. The last operative reactor at Chernobyl closed down in 2000. Yes, there are 20,000 spent fuel rods in a pool. They're slowly cooling down. but each of them has about the equivalent of 35 watts or a night light to them. And so if you left them in that pool of water for a week, it might, without doing anything to it, it might get to the temperature of a warm bath. Now, as for the actual melted down portion of Chernobyl, where the real trouble occurred 36 years ago, there's no power or water required to keep it safe. It's inside a shelter.
But there are operations still going on, decommissioning operations. What are the options of restoring power to Chernobyl? And why would the Russians want to be in that area, which is uninhabitable because of contamination from radioactive materials?
It's a good question. There are a couple of other connections to the grid which could be reactivated, one inside Ukraine, one which comes from Belarus, which was turned off right before the invasion. So you could get the power on there fairly quickly, in theory. And there are a few hundred people who work there, and on a good day, it's a dark and dank place to work. Strategically, it makes good sense for the Russians to be there. It's north of Kiev, straight shot into the capital, and there is a sophisticated electrical switching station there, which they may want to control.
Ukraine does rely heavily on nuclear power for its electricity. Number of nuclear power plants across the country. What is the danger, or how dangerous is it to have a battlefield like this?
Yeah. This is where you get into the nightmare scenario. There are 15 operative reactors there, and if you cut off power to one of them, you could march down the road to a Fukushima scenario. You need water flowing over the hot core of these operating plants in order to keep them from melting down. Since Fukushima, plants all over the world have bolstered their defense in depth to try to ensure against this, but we're not exactly certain how well defended these plants are. You know, John, this is unprecedented. We cannot think of another time in history when nuclear power plants have been caught in the crossfire of war.
I think he is a war criminal. Those were the words of President Biden today, referring to Vladimir Putin and his campaign in Ukraine. Civilians still bear the brunt of the fighting, especially in Ukraine's south. Now entering its fourth week, the war shows little sign of letting up, despite negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. A daytime curfew is now in effect in Kyiv, leaving streets emptied as the sounds of Russian shelling can be heard echoing from the city's outskirts. Jane Ferguson is in the capital city, and she begins our coverage again tonight.
In Ukraine's capital today, firefighters battle to put out a blaze after yet another brutal strike. Civilians and their homes continue to be Russia's targets of choice. The top floor of this residential building completely gutted. Emergency workers frantically try to evacuate or comfort anyone alive, but there is no consolation. Residents look up as billows of smoke rise over their homes, now rubble. Nearby buildings were also not spared. Natalia, who lives close to the explosion site, shows the remains inside her destroyed apartment.
Thank God, we are lucky that we are alive and not injured. We had taped the windows, but the blast blew it anyway.
Hundreds of miles to the south, the port city of Mariupol continues to suffer some of the fiercest fighting. This hospital, one of the few remaining to take in injured patients, is dealing with the slaughter of civilians. Its basement used to be a food storage area, now turned into a morgue. Dead bodies lay waiting to be picked up.
Because all the other hospitals were bombed and none could collect them. There's no emergency services. There's nobody.
And the greatest loss of all, that of life barely begun. This baby was 22 days old. To stop the war, President Zelensky today urged the West to do more. Speaking to a packed auditorium of congressional members this morning,
is this a lot to ask, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask? A humanitarian no-fly zone so that Russia would not be able to terrorize our free cities.
Several hours later, President Biden announced an additional $800 million of assistance to the embattled nation. The package includes anti-aircraft systems and small but lethal drones.
This could be a long and difficult battle, but the American people will be steadfast in our support of the people of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, there are cautious hopes of a potential breakthrough in talks between Moscow and Kyiv. Today, both sides made progress on a peace deal that would include a ceasefire if Ukraine promises neutrality and abandons its NATO ambitions. But Russian President Vladimir Putin showed little sign of compromise.
All our goals will be achieved. We will provide security for Russia and our people, and we will never allow Ukraine to serve as a base for acts of aggression against our country.
And he had a chilling message for those within Russia who oppose the war and look to the West for progress.
The Russian people will always be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors, and simply spit them out like a fly that accidentally flew into the mouth. Spit them out. I am convinced that such a natural and necessary cleansing of society will only strengthen our country.
A senior U.S. defense official said today Russian forces remain mostly stalled. But today, for the first time, Russian warships launched missiles near the key port of Odessa. In the north, Russian soldiers continue to operate northwest and northeast of Kyiv.
Ukrainian forces are claiming new successes tonight against Russian invaders. A counteroffensive has retaken a strategically important town west of Kyiv, and the southern port city of Mariupol continues holding out, despite being hammered from air, land, and sea. Meanwhile, the White House announced that President Biden will unveil new sanctions when he meets with allies this week in Europe. And the top Kremlin spokesman said that Russia would use nuclear weapons only if its very existence was threatened. But we begin again tonight with Jane Ferguson, who starts her report in southwestern Ukraine.
The people of Mykolaiv are forced to run for cover as they come under attack by the Russian army. This time, the explosions are closer than ever.
We've heard not only the air sirens, but now these alarms and people telling everybody to get into the bunkers. Up until now, it's been mostly fighting and shelling on the outskirts of town, but these rockets are now starting to land right here in the center.
The Russian military is trying to move west from the nearby city of Kherson, one of the few urban centers they control, in an effort to take all of Ukraine's southern Black Sea coastline. This time, a Russian rocket crashed straight through a small hotel. It was closed owing to the war, but residents in the apartment building behind it were left shaken, cleaning up the damage to their homes.
We live here. We are out and just arrived, and this is what happened. They called us on the phone to tell us what happened. I haven't gone inside yet. We are too afraid to go inside. Now we clean up. There is a lot to do.
That collective sense of initiative is seen in this village also, to the east of Mykolaiv and in the way of the Russian army as it tries to advance towards the city. Local volunteers hand out food donated by individuals and aid organizations.
Our town is on the front line. Today and almost every day we are being shot at, so we cannot go to town to shop for food. Also, the businesses that were here are now closed. The prices of food are rising every day, and people cannot provide for themselves. That's why we decided to set up this center. This will help people at least a bit.
6,000 people used to live here. Now, only about 2,000 remain, local people tell us, as homes have been destroyed and life becomes simply too dangerous. The people of Mykolaiv are even donating food to the city's zoo. Items not fit for humans are being dropped here to keep the animals alive, like these sheep killed in the fields by the fighting and brought in by a farmer.
All sort of people and organizations help us, including ordinary citizens. Old ladies bring a sack of apples or some bread. NGOs donate hay to us or any other food that could not have been used for people, but they are bringing it to us, to the zoo. Other zoos from across Europe have also donated specialist food to us.
Viktor Diakonov is the lead biologist at the zoo.
The animals are afraid. Some of them refuse to eat, especially when the explosions are constant.
3 rockets have landed in the compound, including one right by the tiger enclosure. But the zoo hasn't lost any of its residents so far. The Mykolaiv Zoo is 120 years old, Ukraine's oldest, and it hosts its most diverse collection of animals. Residents of the city are trying their best to preserve it, some volunteering here to help prepare food for the animals. As all across the country, citizens of Ukraine continue to collectively resist Russia's invasion. And on most battlefields, Ukrainian troops are holding their ground.
We have everything. We have javelins. We have all we need.
In the south, the government said today its soldiers are trying to take back Kherson, the first city to fall under Russian control. And a Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kyiv continues its efforts to drive back the Russians from the outskirts of the capital. Ukraine's military also said it retook the strategic town of Makariv, about 40 miles west of Kyiv. A senior U.S. defense official said Russian forces have not moved closer to the capital, even though parts of the suburbs of Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel remain under Russian control. But White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said today Moscow will never truly win the war.
Whether Russia takes a city or takes a town or takes more territory, they are never going to be able to achieve the purpose that they set out, which was to subjugate this country, to bring this country to heel, because the Ukrainian people have made very clear that they will not be subjugated, no matter what it takes.
And President Volodymyr Zelensky is also willing to do whatever it takes to defend his country. Last night, he said Ukraine could consider dropping its bid to join NATO if Russian troops withdraw and Moscow guarantees Ukraine's security. But, he said, any peace deal must be approved by the Ukrainian people.
To be honest, the issues of security guarantees, we are talking here about constitutional changes, change of Ukrainian law. Whatever happens, this will not be decided only by the president.
Ukraine's agriculture minister announced today that the area in which the country's spring crop will be planted might shrink by more than half this year, compared with the levels expected before the Russian invasion. As a major exporter of wheat, other grains, and vegetable oils, this hit to Ukraine's production will affect the global food supply and, experts say, drive up food prices, which were already at all-time highs. And as Stephanie Tsai reports, this will only worsen the food security of some of the world's most vulnerable people.
The war in Ukraine is a continent away, but its impacts are ricocheting in this market in northwest Syria. Prices for food are skyrocketing in Idlib.
We know a lot of necessary food essentials originate in Ukraine, and especially for us, so we definitely feel the impact.
This bakery uses flour made with wheat from Ukraine to bake flatbread, a local staple.
There's a shortage and a chance the wheat will stop coming in if this war continues.
People like Bassem El-Hussein are worried about being able to feed their families.
I have a family of 8. Bread is really expensive. We used to buy this for 2.5 lira. Now it's 5 lira. But if we ate this now, we won't be full. I have kids who will only eat lunch, not anything else the rest of the day now.
Food prices in Syria were already at record highs last year, and 11 years of civil war have left 60% of Syrians food insecure. Syria used to grow enough wheat to feed its population, but the conflict, multiple droughts, and a dire economic situation mean it increasingly relies on international imports, mainly from Russia and also Ukraine. The Black Sea region straddling Russia and Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe because of the bounty from its fertile soil. Wheat production is so central to Ukraine's identity, it's reflected on the nation's flag. The colors symbolize blue skies over golden fields of grain. But since the Russian invasion, farmers have left those fields for safety or to take up arms. Besides, the government banned exports of staple crops, a wartime measure to attempt to feed Ukrainians as the conflict disrupts the country's supply lines. Shipping from the region has also been disrupted. All of this is putting a squeeze on populations in the world most vulnerable to hunger.
Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now, their breadbasket is being bombed.
According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, 18 developing countries, including Yemen, Somalia, and Lebanon, import at least half of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. In Lebanon, officials are scrambling to make up for a predicted shortage. A massive explosion at a port in Beirut in 2020 destroyed the Middle Eastern country's main grain silos.
Without the presence of silos in Lebanon to store wheat, we import wheat according to our needs. The quantities we have are enough for 1 month because it is being stored in mills.
We're really in uncharted territories.
Michael J. Puma is the director of the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University. He says high energy prices and disruptions to exports of fertilizer from Russia and its ally, Belarus, could also affect the global food supply in coming years.
The countries below the Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, are importing above 70% of their potassium fertilizers from just Russia and Belarus. So, what are the impacts of not having sufficient fertilizer? Well, you can't get anywhere near the yields that you need to feed your population.
International aid agencies are also feeling the pinch.
We get about 50% of our wheat and grain from inside Ukraine. Ukraine alone grows enough food to feed 400 million people on planet Earth.
The head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, visited Ukraine last week. He says the UN agency now faces higher prices and less supply to carry out its operations around the world and provide aid to Ukrainians in besieged cities.
We've got enough supplies moving right now inside Ukraine and coming into transit in Ukraine to reach about 3 million people over the next 30 days. I tell you, it's going to be tough to negotiate with the military forces that are blocking access, and we're going to demand that access because, in my opinion, it's a crime against humanity to see people denied aid when they're just innocent victims of conflict.
Are you having to cut elsewhere in order to feed the refugees coming out of Ukraine and the people in Ukraine?
Yeah. Let me tell you, before Ukraine hit, we were already short of funds. We were cutting, for example, in Yemen, 8 million people. We just cut to 50% rations because of lack of funds before Ukraine. In fact, we're looking at having to cut those 8 million down to 0 rations. Don't ask us to choose which children we feed or don't feed, which children live, which children die. That's not fair to us. Let's reach all the children. We can do it. We just need the resources to do it.
Before Russia invaded Ukraine, other conflicts, such as the war in Syria, were already leading to hunger. Yusuf al-Jadoa had come to rely on food assistance. Now he's worried that will go away.
When we first arrived, our situation was okay. We had sugar, flour, and food was affordable. After the war began in Ukraine, we started getting less sugar and flour. Actually, there is no more sugar at all here now. No more butter, no more olive oil. Our situation is really bad. Did all the NGOs go to Ukraine? Did they forget about us? Please do not forget us.
The spring planting season is meant to start soon in Ukraine, but with a war in full swing, crops will go unsown, and experts say hungry mouths around the world unfed. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
We'll see. That was President Biden's reaction today to the news that Russia said it would curtail some of its military activity in northern Ukraine. American officials across the administration echoed that caution. The U.S. believes Moscow is moving troops away from Kyiv to redeploy them elsewhere, including the Donbass region. Today, Russian forces also continued their bombardment of cities in southern Ukraine. Meantime, talks in Turkey between Ukraine and Russia showed some signs of progress, and that's where special correspondent Jack Hewson begins our coverage tonight, reporting from Kharkiv.
In Istanbul today, Turkish officials tried to set a friendly tone as Ukrainian and Russian negotiators meet for the first round of in-person talks in nearly 3 weeks. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who earlier this month offered to be a mediator, highlighted the meeting's gravity.
As members of the delegations, you've taken on a historic responsibility. The whole world is awaiting the good news that will come from you.
After the meeting, Ukraine sent Moscow its most detailed proposal yet for a future peace deal, raising hopes for talks between the two leaders.
We think that we have worked through enough material so that a meeting between the presidents of Ukraine and the Russian Federation can be made possible. We have sent the proposal to the Russian side and are waiting for their answer.
Ukraine pledged to remain neutral without joining military alliances or hosting military bases, in exchange for security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5, which says an attack against one ally is considered as an attack against all allies. Turkey, Germany and Poland were named among the potential guarantors of Ukraine's security. Ukraine also proposed a 15-year negotiation period over the status of Crimea, which Russia invaded and annexed in 2014. Meanwhile, Russia said it would drastically reduce its military activity in northern Ukraine, including around Kyiv.
The Russian military has been signaling a likely shift in strategy for at least the last week and a half, if not longer. Their offensives on most fronts have stalled out. They were conducting an operational pause. They'd lost the momentum. And the one area where they were still making gains was in the fight for the Donbass and in the fight for the Ukrainian city of Mariupol.
Michael Kaufman is a Russia expert at the Center for Naval Analyses, a non-profit research organization.
This is less a withdrawal or retreat and more of a retrenchment, or to be frank, a redeployment of Russian forces, throwing them behind the other troops that the Russian military has, fighting in the Donbass where they're trying to encircle Ukrainian troops.
Throughout the country, Ukrainian soldiers have put up strong resistance. In this town northwest of Kyiv, they take abandoned Russian tanks as their trophies.
We kicked out the Russians from here, and they are now several kilometers away. We will advance and will free more in the coming days.
Further east, Ukraine continues its battle for Kharkiv. Russian military losses mount, but civilian lives are not spared. The city, home to nearly 1.5 million people before the war, has suffered some of the most relentless bombardment.
Talk of peace and reduced military activity has had little impact on the ground here in Kharkiv. The regional government has reported 46 strikes on the city over the past 24 hours, predominantly mortar fire, and the sound of incoming and outgoing rounds of artillery can regularly be heard.
Russian attacks today also continued in the south. In the port city of Mykolaiv, the governor's office torn apart. Emergency workers rushed to evacuate anyone alive.
This is just a nightmare. A girl died on my floor. What can I say?
Inside, the workplace now turned into wreckage. Surveillance footage caught the missile strike. After the impact, huge billows of smoke. To evacuate those still trapped by the violence, Ukraine said 3 humanitarian corridors were agreed today after a day-long pause, including one from Mariupol, where tens of thousands of civilians still try to escape the devastation. But in another impassioned speech, President Volodymyr Zelensky said more needed to be done to punish Russia.
Yes, we can say that the signals we hear from the talks are positive, but these signals can't silence the explosions of Russian shells. Sanctions must get stronger weekly, and they must be of high quality.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jack Hewson in Kharkiv, Ukraine.
Ukrainian prosecutors investigating possible Russian war crimes say they found 410 bodies in the towns surrounding Kyiv. Meantime, Moscow continues to deny its military is targeting civilians. But as Russian troops pull back from those areas, correspondent Ali Rogan reports they are scorching the earth behind them. A warning, some of the images in this story are disturbing.
In the wake of Russia's withdrawal from the Kyiv suburbs, a trail of death. In the town of Bucha, hundreds of bodies lay in mass graves. And on the roads, what Ukrainian officials say is evidence of war crimes.
Is this genocide?
This morning, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was explicit.
Indeed, this is genocide.
But Secretary of State Antony Blinken would not go as far.
Do you see this as genocide?
Look, we will look hard and document everything that we see, put it all together.
As they returned to towns deserted but destroyed by Russia, Ukrainian forces received a warm welcome.
We prayed, we asked God to give our warriors, our defenders, health and God's protection.
Ukrainian and Western officials say Russia is shifting its forces and focus from the north and capital region to the south and east.
We think this is the redeployment, in our opinion. They're changing the tactics now.
In the port city of Odessa today, residents woke up to a Russian attack on an oil facility.
This is not a good morning for Odessa. We woke up to powerful explosions near our home. The impact was huge. It was terrifying.
further along the coast, the city of Mariupol remains under siege. On Sunday, the Red Cross tried for the third day in a row to bring aid in and get civilians out. But the Russians have not honored their pledge to allow safe passage.
The Russian military is beginning to refocus its assault on eastern Ukraine, and Russia's President Vladimir Putin has named an overall military commander for the war, one with a resume notable for killing civilians and wreaking wholesale destruction in Syria. We began by looking at this change in strategy. Here's Nick Schifrin.
In southeastern Ukraine, Russian forces are moving into position. Russia says it's targeting newly arrived Ukrainian air defense systems. And in Mariupol, where the mayor said today 10,000 civilians have been killed, Russia's deploying recently recruited conscripts.
What can I say? They called me up to go to war. I got a call from my school to come to the recruiting station.
Satellite images show what a senior U.S. defense official calls an 8-mile-long resupply mission into Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russians have occupied territory since 2014. That convoy is moving through Verlikhy Borluk toward Izium and further south to reinforce Russians fighting in the Donbass and try and connect with territory they occupy as far west as Kherson.
This next week will be just as tense. Russian troops will move to even larger operations in the east of our state. They can use even more missiles against us, but we are preparing for their actions.
Those actions in the east will be led by General Alexander Dvornikov, the first commander named to oversee the war in Ukraine. He led Russia's campaign of scorched earth in Syria, using starvation and indiscriminate targeting of residential neighborhoods to destroy Syrians' ability to resist.
We're probably turning another page in the same book of Russian brutality.
But while Russia's focus will be on the east, U.S. officials say there's no evidence that Vladimir Putin has given up on his goal to overthrow Kyiv.
Russia suffered a blow today in its war with Ukraine when the flagship of its naval fleet in the Black Sea exploded and sank. Ukraine said it hit the ship with missiles. The Russians said the fire was accidental. The guided missile cruiser Moskva had 500 sailors on board, and most were evacuated. In Washington, the Pentagon assessed the ship's loss.
It's basically designed for air defense. That's what this ship is designed to do, not unlike our own cruisers. So it's going to have an impact on their capabilities, certainly in the near term. Whether it has an impact on their naval capabilities in the long term is just unclear right now.
Russia has admitted for the first time that last week's sinking of its flagship cruiser, the Moskva, left dozens missing and one dead, although it still denies Ukraine attacked the ship. On the battlefront, Ukrainian officials claim Russian troops are redeploying from the southern port city of Mariupol to reinforce their new onslaught in the east. In the meantime, Ukraine says it sent a nighttime helicopter to deliver arms to the last Ukrainian forces in Mariupol who are holed up inside a giant steel facility. Willem Marks begins our coverage.
In the city of Mariupol, ghostly remnants of a relentless war. This is what Russia calls liberation. Apartment blocks battered by shelling, devoid of residents. The only signs of life, pro-Russian rescue workers locating the dead. They load people's remains onto trucks marked with Z, a symbol of Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion. The dead's destination for now, unknown. Today, a Ukrainian regional governor still seemed optimistic about Mariupol's future.
I unequivocally believe that Russians can be defeated. They are not taught to lose, but they overestimate themselves.
The last few Ukrainian fighters are bunkered down in a steel plant by the sea. Russian forces say they'll no longer try to storm that facility, but instead will besiege it. British officials say it's likely Russia prefers simply to surround it, to free up their forces for operations elsewhere. On social media channels, pro-Kremlin propagandists embedded with the Russian army publish videos they say show troops moving east, away from Mariupol. But military analysts say Russian forces in the city suffered substantially, and Moscow may struggle to redeploy rapidly to other battle fronts. One Russian commander talked of fresh territorial ambitions in the south of Ukraine, suggesting a new access route to Transnistria, a pro-Russian enclave in neighboring Moldova. It's unclear if these comments reflect official Kremlin policy. Back east, meanwhile, Russian troops continue their assault on the Donbass. Overnight, a hospital near Donetsk damaged under direct shell fire. In the city of Rubizhne, broken boulevards bear the scars of conflict. A cultural center crushed by artillery. In a basement beneath it, a dozen of the city's residents shelter together. Ludmila said she fled her home after the shells began to fall.
It was raining, the roof was leaking, the plaster and wallpaper fell off, a constant draft. It is impossible to live in our houses. No gas, no light, no water.
To the north, in Kharkiv, emergency workers on scene at a public market, smashed and torched. The city remains a top target for Russian rockets, leaving residents to deal with the daily damage. Yuri Gurupayev said 2 civilians charred to death inside this vehicle.
How is it different from Bucha or Hostomel? And we're told it's quiet here? How is it possible? Here are people burning. Here are 2 people burning. Look, bodies. How is it possible?
Despite the bombing, thousands of Ukrainians plan to return this weekend to celebrate Orthodox Easter. Like Maria Litok, who arrived today in Kiev from Poland to meet her family.
I am now confident that the world is aware that we are strong. It is important because just a few people knew about Ukraine. Now almost every person can show the city of Kharkiv on a map.
Home for the holidays, but for how long, unclear.
Tonight, and despite advances by Russian forces on multiple fronts in the south and east, in cities like Kiev, it's not so much about clearing up as pushing back against that military aggression. The national flag is still fluttering behind me, traffic has returned to the city centre, and with the evening curfew pushed back till late, restaurants and bars remain open for customers. But just an hour or 2 from where we're standing, awful scenes of devastation and destruction in many directions throughout surrounding towns and villages.
President Biden announced a new $30+ billion proposal to help Ukraine today as Congress passed a bill that would make it easier to send weapons to Ukraine and NATO allies. About 2/3 of the Biden request is for military assistance. The rest is for economic and humanitarian aid. As the war rages on, the United Nations Secretary General is on a week of shuttle diplomacy. He met on Tuesday with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and today in Kyiv, he met President Volodymyr Zelensky, a meeting punctuated by Russian missile strikes. Nick Schifrin again begins our coverage.
All that's left of Ukraine's defense of Mariupol under fire and underground. For those forced to hide for weeks, it is terrifying. This was a makeshift hospital inside their final holdout, the Azovstal steelworks. From a secret location, a Ukrainian commander vowed to fight until the end.
The tactic now is like a medieval siege. We're encircled. They are no longer throwing lots of force to break our defensive line. They're conducting airstrikes.
New satellite images show Putin's apparent plan, not to storm the plant, but to flatten it. Russian-backed separatists control the city's center, where the bodies of Ukrainians they killed lie in stacks. Local officials today warned of outbreaks of disease. And a senior U.S. defense official said today Russian forces are leaving the city as Russia makes, quote, slow progress for their goal, the eastern Donbass. And Russian forces launched new attacks along a strategic frontline highway from Kharkiv to Izium, including Slobozhansk and Donetsk. In nearby Liman, Ukrainian soldiers fear a new ground invasion. The town's already suffered airstrikes that have blown out people's homes. The strikes continue. Elena marks civilian on her fence, hoping it saves her.
There is no electricity. We live in the basement and cook food over campfire. We don't have a place to go.
Nearby, a strike hit a railway warehouse. It's part of Russia's campaign to target the delivery of Western weapons.
Every day, the Ukrainians...
Today, President Biden pressed Congress to deliver Ukraine more weapons.
So we need to contribute arms, funding, ammunition, and the economic support to make their courage and sacrifice have purpose so they can continue this fight and do what they're doing.
The $33 billion is more than 5 times Ukraine's annual military budget and would include $20.4 billion in weapons, $8.5 billion in economic assistance, and $3 billion in humanitarian assistance.
Russia continued assault is yielding immense human cost. We've seen them leave behind horrifying evidence of their atrocities and war crimes.
And that is what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres witnessed today. He toured Bordianka and Bucha, what he called the epicenter of unbearable heartbreak and pain, and envisioned his own family as victims of terror.
What I feel, I imagine my family in one of those houses that is now destroyed and black. I see my granddaughters running away in panic, part of the family eventually killed. So the war is an absurdity in the 21st century.
Guterres walked through the secure middle of Kyiv to meet President Volodymyr Zelensky and pledged more UN assistance. As they met, multiple missiles struck a residential building in central Kyiv and blew out windows across a city block. Guterres warned that by the end of the year, 25 million Ukrainians, more than half the country, would be in need of humanitarian assistance.
For the 70% of Ukrainians who are Orthodox Christian, the celebration of Easter this year was fraught with extra meaning. Ukraine's Orthodox Church split from its Russian parent when Vladimir Putin first invaded Ukraine 8 years ago. And now religion's role in the conflict is front and center. Here is Nick Schifrin.
In the center of Ukraine's capital, where even the divine needs defense, a priest leads soldiers seeking blessings. On Orthodox Easter last month, those who needed the most protection found a quiet moment to request it. Ukrainians are fighting a war that threatens their very existence, and in the presence of God, they pray not only for restoration, but also judgment, which is what Father Feodosi provides. He blesses Ukrainians and scorns Russian soldiers accused of war crimes.
It is tragic that people who call themselves Christian allow themselves to do such things.
Metropolitan Epiphany, the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, goes further. He condones killing Russian soldiers in the name of saving the country and has likened Russian President Vladimir Putin to the Antichrist. Putin replies with his own judgment via his own ally. On Orthodox Easter in Moscow, the service is led by Patriarch Kirill, a longtime Kremlin partner. He portrays the war as part of Moscow's defense of eastern Ukraine from what he disparages as Western ideals.
The Donbass is a rejection of the so-called values offered by those who lay claim to global domination. Today, there is a certain test for loyalty to that power. Do you know what that test is? It's a gay parade.
Putin and his confederates, including those in the church, present the war as almost like a sacred crusade against the presumably godless West.
Cyril Hovorin is a Ukrainian Orthodox priest and professor of theology at University College Stockholm. I spoke to him from Ukraine via Skype.
They believe Ukraine is the cradle of what they call the Russian civilization, and it has a kind of mystical, I would say mythical connectedness with modern Russia. I personally would call this ideology "Make Russia Great Again." I think that is a kind of the essence of what Putin tries to achieve with the support of the church.
Patriarch Kirill gives religious cover to Putin's political ambitions, as he did on Sunday.
I wanted to say my heartfelt gratitude to those who are here today, but even more so wanted to say thanks again to the government and the army of ours that today, in practically war conditions, defend our country.
He also repeats Putin's rhetoric of self-defense.
We are a very peace-loving country and a peace-loving and long-suffering people.
The reality? Kirill used those words the very day Ukrainian authorities in Bucha exposed mass graves full of executed civilians, bound and shot. Hor Varun used to work for Kirill and quit in 2012.
I tried to convince him that this ideology is going to be extremely dangerous, destructive for the church, for himself, for Russia, and for Ukraine. We see this outcome, this result of this ideology, moving, masses of people, masses of Russian soldiers to fight in Ukraine, and securing a very wide support for Putin in his war.
For more than 1,000 years, Ukrainian Orthodox churches sat inside a larger Russian Orthodox church. But then Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. By 2019, Ukraine's president and the overall head of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople declared the Ukrainian Orthodox Church independent. That means at this Ukrainian Orthodox service in Lviv, Father Viktor Kaida can feature the Ukrainian language and speak freely about Russia. As seen on a local TV report, he used to lead a Ukrainian Orthodox church in the southern city of Kherson, parts of which are occupied today by Russia. He says religious divides became political.
Belonging to either the Russian or Ukrainian Orthodox churches makes a big difference. Russia knows that, and that's why it is so important for them to maintain its influence. When the priest says this is good and this is evil, people listen and believe. It's an element of control over a large number of people. Let's be frank, it's brainwashing.
Pope Francis has also criticized the Russian Orthodox Church and recently warned Patriarch Kirill against becoming Putin's, quote, altar boy. In 2016, the two broke 1,000 years of schism between the Vatican and the Orthodox Church, but recent attempts to meet have failed. And Pope Francis, the leader of 1 billion Catholics, repeatedly condemns an unnamed aggressor.
Sia pace per la martoriata Ucraina.
Peace upon tormented Ukraine, sorely tried by the violence and destruction of the cruel and senseless war into which it was dragged.
Dragged but not defeated. And on this recent Orthodox Easter, the flock was reminded of Ukrainian tradition.
Even before this war, for generations, we've had this saying, Christ has risen, Ukraine will rise too. We hope that maybe, after having celebrated the resurrection of Christ, we will have our own resurrection.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin in Lviv.
The battle for the city of Mariupol appears to be over after hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers surrendered from their final holdout. The city has suffered one of Europe's bloodiest battles since World War II. And now Russia appears to hold the entire Ukrainian port, its largest gain of the war. Nick Schifrin has the story.
Ukrainian soldiers wounded but alive and in the custody of their enemy. Russian TV showed its version of what appears to be the beginning of the end of the siege of Mariupol. A lonely procession of the wounded, some of the final Ukrainian holdouts from the Azovstal steel plant, what Russia today called a mass surrender. Ukraine admits more than 260 soldiers are being bused to Russian-controlled territory inside Ukraine. Some today arrived in the separatist-controlled Olenivka, on the site of a former penal colony known for torture and squalid conditions. They held out for nearly 3 months, living and fighting from tunnels designed to withstand nuclear attacks, many of them in the Azov regiment, born from a right-wing militia now integrated into the Ukrainian military. Their resistance prevented Russia from consolidating its gains, and today Ukrainian officials called them heroes.
Mariupol drew in the Russian Federation's forces for 82 days. Their operation to seize the east and the south was held up. It changed the course of the war.
An unknown number of Ukrainian soldiers remain inside the plant, but Ukraine today said their mission is no longer to fight. Today in Kyiv, those soldiers' families begged for their release, even into Russian custody.
They are trying everything to get them out. We try ourselves to help them in any way possible.
They eat once a day. We hope for extraction. This is what we're fighting for. I don't see another way out.
The city of Mariupol is a city in ruins. Ukrainian officials estimate a brutal 10-week siege killed 20,000 civilians and destroyed 90% of the city. The WHO warns it could now face outbreaks of cholera. The only videos of the city today heavily curated by pro-Russian separatist occupiers. Ukraine says residents are forced to work in exchange for food. But Russia's control of the city appears to complete its objectives in southeast Ukraine. Before the invasion, Russian separatists controlled territory up to about a dozen miles east of Mariupol. Today, Russian forces have seized a 500-mile strip along the southern coast, giving Russia a land bridge to Crimea annexed in 2014.
This gives Russia a corridor of land over which it can resupply and access Crimea, its forces in Crimea, its people in Crimea.
Kevin Ryan is a retired U.S. Army brigadier general who served as defense attaché in Russia. He's now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center.
What's the significance of Russia being able to claim that it has seized all of Mariupol, including the plant?
Well, domestically for Putin, this is important for himself politically to be able to show that he has achieved a victory. Once the forces that are engaged in taking Mariupol are finished with their mission, those Russian forces can be directed elsewhere. They could go to the southwest and present a threat to Odessa, or they could be used to move up into the eastern part of Ukraine and to help completely occupy the Donbas region.
In the Donbass, Russian shells continue to devastate residential neighborhoods like in Bakhmut today. The top of an apartment complex ripped off and gutted. Among the wounded, a little boy, whom first responders fought to save. Ukrainian soldiers are fighting back with recently arrived American howitzers. Ukrainian officials say these weapons will allow them to launch counterattacks. But it's not easy to evict Russian forces from territory they occupied.
The size of the Ukrainian military versus the size of the Russian military just simply doesn't seem to suggest that they could kick the Russian forces out of the land that Russia already occupies.
And now that includes Mariupol. Its final defenders are today at the mercy of the Russian military. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
President Biden threw his support behind Finland and Sweden's bids to join NATO today. He welcomed their leaders to the White House a day after they formally submitted their applications in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At a Rose Garden event, the president said both countries would be valued members of the defensive alliance.
Finland and Sweden make NATO stronger. Not just because of their capacity, but they're strong, strong democracies. And a strong, united NATO is the foundation of America's security. By joining NATO, allies make a sacred commitment to one another, that an attack on one is an attack against all.
But the government of another NATO member, Turkey, opposes their effort to join the alliance. It has accused the Nordic countries of supporting Kurdish militants who it claims threaten Turkey's security. The president of Finland addressed Turkey's objections while at the White House.
As NATO allies, we will commit to Turkey's security just as Turkey will commit to our security. We are open to discussing all the concerns Turkey may have concerning our membership in an open and constructive manner.
Meanwhile, more help is on the way for Ukraine. The U.S. Senate voted overwhelmingly today to send the country an additional $40 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid. And the Biden administration also authorized $100 million more in military assistance. It includes long-range howitzers, radars, and other field equipment.
Today, the administration unveiled a new $700 million package of weapons for Ukraine. It includes the most advanced rockets yet to be used in that country's conflict with Russia. The High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, that the U.S. is sending can hit targets 45 miles away and comes with increased targeting capacity. To discuss this, we're joined by Amanda Sloat, Senior Advisor to the President and Senior Director for Europe on the National Security Council staff. Amanda Sloat, welcome to the NewsHour. Ukraine's been asking for these HIMARS for months. Why are you sending them now?
So we have actually been responding to what Ukraine has been asking for throughout the crisis. When the war started in late February, Ukraine's top priorities were anti-tank, anti-armor, and anti-aircraft systems, and that's exactly what we provided them. And the Ukrainians used those weapons to great effect to drive the Russians out of Kyiv. As the conflict started to move east, the Ukrainians then started asking for howitzers, for artillery. We've provided over 200,000 rounds of artillery and other forms of ammunition. Now that the conflict is continuing in the east and south, the Ukrainians have asked us for these higher caliber, more precision targeted weapons, as you said, and so we are responding to their request request, as we have throughout the crisis.
The U.S. is capping the range of the ammunition being provided for these HIMARS. Why is that important when Ukraine has guaranteed, President Zelensky himself guaranteed to President Biden, that Ukraine will not use this ammunition to cross the border and fire into Russia?
So it is our assessment that given where the battle is, the state of the battle in the Donbass, that this is the most effective system for the Ukrainians at this stage in the fight. Obviously, we will continue to assess the situation as we have over the last number of months. And based on conversations that the administration has had with the Ukrainians in the last number of days as we've rolled out this system, the Ukrainians have told us that they are very satisfied with the degree of assistance that we are providing them.
We begin tonight with news out of Ukraine, what may be a major shift as Russian forces take over a pivotal eastern city. For Russians, a high priority, as Moscow claimed full control of the eastern Ukraine city of Lysychansk.
As a result of successful offensive actions, we have closed the encirclement around Lysychansk. The Ukrainian troops are completely blocked in another cauldron.
But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, meeting with the Australian Prime Minister in Kiev, insisted the fierce fight for Lysychansk is not over yet. The city of about 100,000 people is the last major Ukrainian stronghold in the Luhansk province. Its neighbor, Severodonetsk, another critical city, was taken by Russia a week ago. If Lysychansk is seized, it will bring Moscow one large step closer to its goal of capturing all of Ukraine's Donbass region. More than 100 miles northwest, residents of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, are cleaning up after a 4 a.m. rocket barrage that damaged homes and a school. One family credited a pet with their safety.
There was just a cherry tree and a fence. Now the fence is destroyed and there is no cherry tree. My wife was lucky that she woke up early in the morning because the roof fell exactly where she had been sleeping.
The dog saved you?
Yes, it didn't let us sleep the whole night.
In some other parts of the country, Zelensky yesterday said that life was beginning to return to normal, but he urged his people not to forget that the battle for Ukraine still rages.
In many home front cities, there is now a feeling of relaxation, but the war is not over. The war continues. Unfortunately, war is only increasing in some places. Do not forget about it.
Historic news this evening from the NATO meeting in Spain. Turkey has removed its opposition to Sweden and Finland joining the security alliance. The Scandinavian nations sought membership after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a deal has now been struck. Our Nick Schifrin is in Madrid for the summit, which starts in earnest tomorrow, and he joins me now. So, Nick, hello. Tell us what led to Turkey changing its mind.
Weeks of back-channel diplomacy between Turkey, Sweden, and Finland, with the U.S. and NATO playing key roles. But, Judy, senior officials even here just a few hours ago didn't know whether this deal would go through. But it went through, and there was a signing ceremony just a few hours ago here in Madrid. NATO, Turkey, Finland, and Sweden, a trilateral agreement, really in which Sweden and Finland gave in to some of President Erdogan's priorities. The agreement states, quote, Finland and Sweden unambiguously condemn all terrorist organizations perpetrating attacks against Turkey, and names the organizations that Turkey defines as terrorist. And that is what a senior Turkish official tells me tonight is the most important part of this document. Number two, the document says that Finland and Sweden will drop embargoes that prevented them from selling Turkey weapons, and Finland and Sweden will address Turkey's requests to deport and extradite Kurds living in those countries. Some of those extraditions actually include journalists, and the U.S., for one, has refused some of Turkey's extraditions demand in the past. But still, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg made this agreement today, and he said it reiterated NATO's core principle that countries that meet the alliance requirement can become members.
NATO's open door policy has been an historic success. Welcoming Finland and Sweden into the alliance will make them safer, NATO stronger, and the Euro-Atlantic area more secure. This is vital as we face the biggest security crisis in decades.
That, of course, is a reference to the war in Ukraine, which has really led, Judy, to a historic shift in European security in a matter of months. As you said, it has been many years that Sweden and Finland have been proud to be military non-aligned. Today, they believe they need NATO to prevent Russia from further attacking, even in their countries.
And Nick, you mentioned the U.S. Tell us about the U.S. role in bringing this about.
Yeah, it really played a key role, but it has downplayed that role from the very beginning. This morning, U.S., Sweden, and Finland really calibrated a key call that President Biden made to Recep Tayyip Erdogan right before Erdogan was leaving Turkey in order to come here to Madrid, as the senior U.S. official who told us put it, to get Erdogan in the right frame of mind. Right before Finland and Sweden made the deal today, they called President Biden just to get his final blessing, and the official said that Biden's really been coordinating all of this with Finland and Sweden since November, trying to get to this day. And the U.S. believes, Judy, that this is the most historic NATO summit in decades.
Today, Russia and Ukraine signed agreements that clear the way for exporting millions of tons of desperately needed Ukrainian grain, as well as guaranteeing Russian exports of its grain and fertilizers. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. Cutting off its supply had sent grain prices higher worldwide and threatened global food security, compounding famine in parts of Africa. John Yang has more.
Judy, the deal aims to end a wartime standoff that's had some 20 million tons of grain stuck in Ukrainian ports since the Russian invasion. 3 Ukrainian ports will now be open. Shipments have been blocked by both a Russian naval blockade and Ukraine's use of mines to defend the ports. Today's agreement guarantees safe passage for Ukrainian vessels from the ports, overseen by a coordination center in Turkey. Earlier, I spoke with a key negotiator, UN Undersecretary Martin Griffiths. I asked him about the significance of the agreement.
The principal significance for us is, of course, the contribution to reducing food insecurity around the world. This is an agreement for the world. It's not an agreement just for Ukraine or Russia or even Europe. And if I'm right, we've seen wheat prices go down today by 4 or 5% because of the agreement. So the 2 ways in which this food insecurity around the world, which has been so attributable in large part to the Ukraine war, is that there'll be much more grain and fertilizers out into the market from both Russia and Ukraine, but also that they will come at a reduced price. I cannot think of an example of an agreement mediated between 2 warring parties in the middle of a hot war, producing a benefit that is attributable to global welfare. I don't think that has happened before.
Russia bombed several key Ukrainian cities today, including Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. It has been under fire since the first day of the invasion, and its proximity to the border makes it an easy target for Russian artillery. But newly delivered Western weapons are helping Ukraine slow down the Russian advance. Special correspondent Volodymyr Solohub and videographer Bohdan Kineshchuk look at life on the front lines.
Kharkiv has been under constant shelling for more than 5 months now. Hundreds of thousands of its residents have fled the city. You can feel the war here on every corner. Just a 10-minute drive from the city limit, and you're in the middle of the war zone. We go there with members of Hartia Volunteer Battalion.
This volunteer battalion has been created at March, and the idea was to protect our city for people who are volunteers. Mostly all of us, we are from Kharkiv and we are protecting our own city.
You can hear the war the moment you leave the city. Soldiers take us to their reconnaissance headquarters. These volunteers are working in close coordination with the regular army units to gather and share intelligence on the Russian movements near Kharkiv. Rubens is a platoon commander.
All of us here, we are not paid by the government. We are all volunteers, and all of us are willing to die defending the city of Kharkiv.
This platoon commander reminds us about his team's main motivation. But there is another source of motivation: these pictures of Russian brigade commanders. This one killed. When talking about Russians and their treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war, Rubens becomes dark. The only thing that brings a smile to his face is one thought.
Till the victory. I think it won't take too long. Until we have victory, no one leaves.
Another team trying to bring that victory one step closer on the outskirts of Kharkiv is this artillery brigade. The Russians are about 10 miles away. Dmytro joined the army and this brigade in early 2021. He fights to evict Russians who've seized territory, including his hometown.
I'm from Kherson. My home is now under occupation. There are guys fighting on that front trying to liberate my home. I'm doing exactly the same on this front, fighting for someone else's home.
And they fight with American weapons. 3 months ago, they received these US howitzers. They're more accurate, their range is about 20 miles, and they're faster loading.
This is a great support from our friends, and it helps us to keep the enemy away in this area. They hit the targets precisely and on time and provide support to our infantry.
Dmytro was among the Ukrainian soldiers that went to Germany to train to operate these weapons. Americans get months of training. These Ukrainians got just 1 week. Ukrainian military say these American M777 howitzers are lighter, easier to operate, but most importantly, more precise. Afterward, they camouflage the howitzers to avoid Russian drones. But they know they'll have to fire again soon. The fighting in this war never seems to stop. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Volodymyr Sologub in Kharkiv, Ukraine.
For the second time in a week, there were mysterious explosions today in Russian-occupied Crimea. A Russian ammunition depot blew up this morning in the peninsula's northeast. Last Wednesday, half a dozen explosions destroyed multiple Russian jets at the Saki air base. Ukraine has not officially taken responsibility. And violence continues near Europe's largest nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia. Russian and Ukrainian officials continue to trade accusations over who is to blame. Nick Schifrin reports.
The Ukrainian soldier filming called it beautiful fireworks. A Russian ammunition depot destroyed in multiple explosions. Another explosion hit an electricity substation. Thick, dark plumes of smoke billowed for hours. It disrupted power and rail traffic in a part of Crimea that Russia has used to attack the rest of southern Ukraine. At least 3,000 people had to evacuate. Russia's appointed Crimea governor admitted it was sabotage.
The detonation is quite strong. There are scattered shells in the field, unfortunately. Therefore, there will be work for the bomb squad. Now we are waiting for the detonation of ammunition to stop. You can hear again another explosion now.
Ukraine didn't claim official responsibility, but on Twitter, minutes after the explosion, Presidential Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak quipped, "The Ukrainian armed forces continue the demilitarization operation to fully rid our land of Russian invaders. Our soldiers are the best sponsors of a good mood. Crimea is Ukraine." Just last week, a massive cloud filled the sky after multiple explosions at a Russian airbase. Russia claimed it was an accident, but satellite images from the Saki airbase before and after the attack show burned earth and multiple fighter jets destroyed. Crimea and its beaches have long been summer tourist destinations. Last week, beachgoers had to flee the explosions, and Ukrainians posted this parody video, telling Russian tourists and troops on Crimea it would be a cruel summer after all. In 2014, Russia occupied and annexed Crimea after a sham referendum. Russia used it on the day of invasion to capture a huge swath of Ukrainian territory. But President Volodymyr Zelensky vows to take it back.
Crimea is Ukrainian, and we will never repudiate it. We will not forget that the Russian war against Ukraine started with the occupation of Crimea, and the Black Sea region cannot be a safe place while Crimea is occupied.
Last week's attack on Saki Air Base was in Crimea's west. Today's was up north, just 30 miles from Russian-occupied Kherson. Ukraine vows to retake that district and the neighboring district, Zaporizhia. That's where Russia seized Europe's largest nuclear plant in early March. In the last week, Russian TV has shown rockets that fell inside the complex. Russia blames Ukraine, but Ukraine says Russia has targeted the parts of the plant that send electricity to Ukraine and is now diverting the power to the Russian grid. Petro Kotin, president of the State Nuclear Authority, recently warned on Ukrainian TV that any accident could be larger than Chernobyl.
The situation is very dangerous. We encountered such a situation at Chernobyl nuclear power plant, if you remember. But there's a very big difference here. There are 6 power units. All of them are filled with nuclear materials.
There has never been a nuclear power plant on the front lines of a war.
Everything depends only on the direction and strength of the wind. If Russia's actions lead to a catastrophe, the consequences may hit those who have yet remained silent.
The battle lines in the 200-day-old war in Ukraine are being drastically redrawn. Ukrainian forces are in the midst of a massive counteroffensive in the eastern region of Kharkiv that has been successful in taking back large swaths of territory previously under Russian control. And tonight there is a major Russian retaliation. Joining us now from Ukraine to discuss the implications of these major developments is Nick Schifrin from Kharkiv. So Nick, what are these officials there in Kharkiv telling you?
Police and military officials, Jeff, here in Kharkiv describe a Russian rout. And as you just said, Russia tonight has responded in a way that it has not responded yet in this 7th-month war. It has attacked Ukraine's critical infrastructure, the electricity grid. Kharkiv, this city that we're in now, is in total blackout after Russia bombed a power plant nearby. Also in blackout, the whole region of Kharkiv and the Donbass region. That is 250 miles from north to south that has no electricity tonight. But all of that came after Ukraine's dramatic gains that have really eroded Russia's ability to hold this critical eastern part of the country. Today, the military and President Zelensky announced the liberation of more than half a dozen villages, most in a line east and southeast of Kharkiv, as you can see there. That follows the liberation of Kupiansk, a major railway hub that Russia was using for logistics, and Izium, Russia's most important base that was in Kharkiv, although police officials here say there is still some fighting in some of those cities. In total, the military says it's liberated at least that huge swath of territory you can see there in blue. That is as much as 1,000 square miles in a matter of days.
So, Nick, why are Ukrainian soldiers having such success?
One aspect that military officials here, as well as independent analysts, point to is that Ukraine launched the counteroffensives simultaneously in eastern and southern Ukraine. That meant that Russia had to move some of its troops into southern Ukraine to handle that aspect of the war, eroding some of the quality and the numbers of Russian troops that could defend Kharkiv. At the same time, Russia was trying to make progress south of here in the Donbass, further eroding some of the numbers of the Russian troops here in Kharkiv. The Ukrainian progress really does put Russia on the defensive, ahead of what President Volodymyr Zelensky said this weekend would be a critical winter.
We have 90 days in front of us, which will solve more than 30 years of Ukrainian independence. This winter will determine our future.
A Ukrainian military official acknowledges that there are some worries about becoming overextended, but Jeff, tonight we see Ukrainian officials attacking south of here.
Meantime, Nick, as you well know, Ukraine shut down the 6th and final reactor at that nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine, which is controlled by Russia and sits at the center of much international concern. Help us understand the significance of that.
All 6 reactors at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are under what's called cold shutdown. That means that they are nowhere near the temperature that they usually are when they're actually on. And that's something that the U.S., as well as nuclear experts here, were calling for. Because if the plant loses all power coming in, if the plant's generators were to fail, the fact that it is under cold shutdown gives everyone a little bit extra time to try and avert a meltdown.
Nick Schifrin reporting for us tonight from Kharkiv, Ukraine. Nick, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Overnight, Russia's President Vladimir Putin announced a draft of hundreds of thousands of military reservists. President Biden and the world are responding today at the annual UN General Assembly. Nick Schifrin is in New York, and he begins our coverage.
On the 210th day of Russia's war in Ukraine, as a Russian rocket left yet another Ukrainian home a mangled mess. As Ukrainian soldiers maintain their momentum, evicting Russian occupiers and capturing equipment as Russian troops flee for their lives, President Vladimir Putin launched Russia's largest mobilization since World War II.
Only military reservists, primarily those who served in the armed forces, will be called up. I have already signed the executive order on partial mobilization.
Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu promised to deploy an additional 300,000 veterans, doubling the number of Russian troops already committed to Ukraine. And in an echo of 2014 in Crimea, Putin endorsed referenda in occupied Ukrainian territory that the U.S. believes will lead to annexation.
We will do everything necessary to create safe conditions for these referenda so people can express their will, and we will support their choice for the future.
Western weapons have helped Ukraine survive and beat Russia back. Putin said the West, quote, had gone too far and unleashed what the U.S. today called a nuclear threat.
Our country has different types of weapons as well, and some of them are more modern than the weapons NATO countries have. In the event of a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and to defend Russia and our people, we will certainly make use of all weapon systems available to us. This is not a bluff.
If nations can pursue their imperial ambitions without consequences, then we put at risk everything this very institution stands for.
4,500 miles away, President Biden addressed the annual UN General Assembly that Putin annually boycotts and called Putin's ambitions in Ukraine total.
This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold.
Biden called the war a shameless violation of the very principle on which the UN was founded.
You cannot seize a nation's territory by force. The only country standing in the way of that is Russia.
Greetings to all people of the world.
This afternoon, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged the world to help Ukraine quickly before Russia can freeze the front lines ahead of the winter.
It wants to prepare fortifications on occupied land and carry out military mobilization at home. We cannot agree to a delayed war because it will be even hotter than the war now. For us, this is a war for life.
In Moscow, the mobilization sparked fury. A rare demonstration against the war ended with what independent rights groups said were more than 1,000 arrests.
Men and women chosen to represent the vast majority of mankind in this new effort to make life safe for the ordinary citizen throughout the globe.
The UN General Assembly launched 76 years ago in the aftermath of 2 world wars in one generation. President Biden harked back to those 1946 delegates' decision to try and bridge a divided world, and today ended with a rallying cry of hope.
The challenges we face today are great indeed, but our capacity is greater. Our commitment must be greater still. We're not passive witnesses to history. We are the authors of history. We can do this. We have to do it for ourselves and for our future, for humankind.
Yes, it's the first. But the very structure of the United Nations, Russia, of course, has a permanent veto on the Security Council, prevents this institution from having very much influence over the war in Ukraine. And that means, Judy, the war will be determined by the Ukrainian military. to fight back against Russia and the West's ability to gain the support that Ukraine so badly needs.
Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin admitted, quote, mistakes in the mobilization of 300,000 Russians to fight in Ukraine. His announcement last week sparked an exodus of Russians fleeing across the border into Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and elsewhere to avoid being conscripted. Despite a troubled history, Russia's neighbor Georgia has accepted the largest number of Russians. Nick Schifrin reports.
At the Upper Lars border checkpoint in Georgia, entire families are mobilizing themselves to escape Putin's mobilization. Relieved Russians arrive however they can, with their prized possessions, by whatever means necessary, to ride out of Russia rather than ride into the war in Ukraine. At one point, so many Russian cars arrived at this checkpoint, the miles-long line could be seen from space. Georgia has now restricted cars, so most of the Russians fleeing war walk, with their wheels, at least as many as they can roll across. Aslan calls his uncle, overjoyed to have escaped, to tell him he'd finally arrived after a 250-mile journey by bike, begun after Putin announced mobilization.
There's terrible traffic here, a sea of people. It's like a real zombie apocalypse.
He also called his mother, who had no idea about his planned escape.
People are moving towards here by foot, with baby strollers, dogs, bags, with whatever they can.
Ivan is a nuclear physicist against the war.
It's very wrong. It's awful. It's I can't comprehend how my fellow Russians can approve it.
Vyacheslav crossed with his girlfriend and friends and camping gear, just in case.
Everybody has different attitudes towards the war, but none of them want to take any part in it.
But he claims he didn't flee out of fear.
There is no panic in Russia, just some young people deciding to leave for a time. I think they are just trying to be careful and to look at things from different angles without taking any risks.
But panic there is. Videos posted online show Russians responding to mobilization with fear and loathing. One man lit a Molotov cocktail and torched a military recruitment post. In Siberia, another man shot a recruitment officer point blank. Some are so desperate to avoid mobilization, they ask their friends to purposely break their leg. Pain apparently worth bearing to avoid inflicting more pain on Ukraine. Moscow seems to have focused the mobilization in areas dominated by ethnic minorities. In mostly Muslim Dagestan, mothers clash with security officials. They chant, "No to war." And they plead with officials. "Why are you so calm?" she says. "Do you know where you are sending them?" They know their sons would be deployed unprepared. This recruit was on his way to occupied Ukraine with no training.
On the 29th, we are being sent to Kherson. So think and decide for yourself what to do with this information going forward. No shooting, no theoretical training, nothing.
But in Russian-occupied Crimea, some cheer mobilization and answer its call. They may not be the best soldiers or the youngest, but Putin is determined to send hundreds of thousands to fill gaps in the front and possibly create new Russian units. And today, Putin admitted to mobilization mistakes and said they would be corrected.
It is necessary to investigate each case separately. If a mistake has been made, it should be corrected, and those drafted unreasonably should return home.
Back at the Russia-Georgia border, 27-year-old Denis is constantly texting. He's waiting for his wife, who's still stuck on the other side of the border. They were traveling together when they hit a line of cars trying to escape. So he bought this bicycle out of fear that Putin might close the border at any minute.
The hardest moment is now, because my wife is still on the other side, and I am extremely worried about her whereabouts.
He joined thousands who rushed the border. He and many of these men claim no opinion on the war, but they say they don't want to be the ones fighting it.
I try to be neutral towards this war and not to stand for Russia or Ukraine. I am just trying to live my life freely with my wife. It was a feeling of relief, a clear feeling of relief, that now everything has been left behind.
Thousands of Russians now walk to an uncertain future, having turned their backs on the war. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
In a grand ceremony at the Kremlin today, Russia's President Vladimir Putin signed papers to formally but illegally annex 4 regions in Ukraine, an area the size of Ohio, after what the West calls sham referendums. The U.S. and allies responded with tougher sanctions and reiterated their support for Ukraine. That all happened at the same time as one of Russia's deadliest strikes on civilians. Nick Schifrin begins our coverage.
Today's reality, the body of a Ukrainian civilian killed by a Russian rocket. Today's alternate reality, a Red Square celebration of conquest, a euphoric concert marking Russian annexation. Reality, Ukrainian soldiers re-seizing their own territory from Russian occupiers. Alternate reality, a hand-picked audience cheers Russian President Vladimir Putin's calling today a day of truth and justice.
Глава Донецкой Народной Республики.
And yet, today's formal annexation signing with the 4 Russian-appointed leaders of Ukrainian districts is the war's largest escalation since invasion.
Только таким может быть.
We will defend our land using all forces and means at our disposal, and will do everything we can to protect the security of our people.
And to an ecstatic audience of elites, Putin rallied against the West and what he defined as its culture.
Хочу еще раз подчеркнуть, именно в алчности.
To maintain its unlimited power is the real reason for the hybrid war that the collective West is waging against Russia. Do we really want in our schools, from the elementary grades, that children are taught that besides a man and a woman, there are other genders? Such a rejection of faith and traditional values begins to look like a perverted religion, outright Satanism.
Putin raised his nuclear rhetoric by recalling U.S. attacks on World War II Japan.
Дважды применившее ядерное оружие.
The United States is the only country in the world to use nuclear weapons twice, destroying the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Actually, they set a precedent.
Putin's actions are a sign he's struggling. The sham referenda he carried out.
In response, President Biden vowed never to respect any Russian claim to Ukrainian land.
He can't seize his neighbor's territory and get away with it. It's as simple as that.
And the U.S. government sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian people and companies, including Elvira Nabiullina, Russia's central bank governor, who's helped the Russian economy survive. Almost 300 Russian lawmakers, family members of Russia's National Security Council, Russians accused of torturing Ukrainians, and Russian military procurement officials.
Порядку в НАТО.
President Volodymyr Zelensky used today to formally apply for an accelerated plan to become a NATO member, and he ruled out negotiations with Putin.
Очевидно, що з цим
It is obvious that this is impossible with this Russian president. He does not know what dignity and honesty are. Therefore, we are ready for a dialogue with Russia, but with a different president of Russia.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Ukraine's NATO membership should be, quote, taken up at a different time. But Putin's nuclear threats top the administration's current concerns.
There is a risk, given all of the loose talk and the nuclear saber-rattling by Putin, that he would consider this, and we've been equally clear about what the consequences would be.
We are tracking the fallout after an explosion consumed parts of the only bridge linking the occupied Crimean Peninsula to Russia. The bridge collapse disrupted a key supply line for Russian troops fighting in southern Ukraine and dealt a major blow to the Kremlin. Ali Rogan has this report.
On the Kerch Bridge, trains carrying fuel caught fire, and a car lane collapsed into the strait below. Closed-circuit television caught the moment of impact. Russia blamed it on a truck bomb and said it killed 3 people. The explosion destroyed just part of the 12-mile bridge, but it's a major blow to the Russian military. The Kerch Bridge is a critical supply line, the only one of its kind linking Crimea with Russia. It spans the Kerch Strait, which links the Black Sea with the Sea of Azov. Russian President Vladimir Putin opened the bridge to great fanfare in 2018 after illegally annexing Crimea 4 years earlier.
At different historical times, people dreamed of building this bridge. Now, finally, thanks to your work, this project, this miracle turned true.
In Kyiv, Ukrainians greeted the bombing of Putin's bridge with joy. By Saturday afternoon, a mock-up of a new commemorative stamp featuring a burning bridge stood in a central square.
The news is very pleasant. Too bad it didn't happen yesterday on Putin's birthday.
Russian investigators have not yet named suspects. For its part, the Ukrainian government reacted with sarcasm. Its official Twitter account tweeted simply, "Sick burn." But in southern Ukraine, the situation was worsening at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Officials said shelling had cut the main power line so that it was now relying on emergency diesel generators. For PBS News Weekend, I'm Allie Rogan.
Ukraine's president said today that roughly 30% of Ukraine's power generation has been attacked and knocked offline by new Russian attacks. Nick Schifrin looks at a Ukraine partially in the dark as the cold descends almost 8 months into the war.
In southern Ukraine today, this is all that's left of a residential building. A giant crater where a home stood for decades. Destruction and death arrive from a clear blue sky. The price of Russian rockets that elude Ukraine's air defenses, this civilian's life as he slept. And the country's infrastructure. Today, Russia struck this combined heat and power plant in Dnipro. For the last month, Russia has targeted Ukraine's electricity grid, especially substations that serve as junction points between cities. Nearly all of Ukraine's substations have been damaged, and President Volodymyr Zelensky admitted today 30% of the country's power plants have been destroyed. But that means in eastern cities like Kyiv-Sharivka, where the destruction is still fresh, residents live without electricity or heat. 9-year-old Artem Panchenko helps his grandmother Irina prepare dinner. He eats in the dark, a family powerless to stop what's coming. They have to cook outside on the fire. Winter in eastern Ukraine is already arriving.
It's really cold. I'm sleeping in my clothes in my apartment.
I think it can be safely assumed that what Russia is trying to do is freeze Ukraine into submission.
Suriya Jayanti is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and co-founder of NA, a U.S.-Ukrainian company focused on green energy transition. She says damaged infrastructure hurts Ukraine's civilians and military, and that Ukraine and Russia are playing cat and mouse. Ukraine fixes damage, Russia strikes it again.
So this seems to be a strike at the nervous system of Ukraine's resistance. This is going to be a very long, very cold, and very dark winter for Ukraine.
And yet Ukrainians remain resilient. In a new Gallup poll released today, 70% say Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins. And of those, 91% define victory as when all territory lost between 2014 and now is regained, including Crimea. But that could be more difficult now that Russia is using Iranian-made kamikaze drones that are 8 feet wide and carry about 100 pounds of explosives. Russia's already launched hundreds of drones. Ukraine has managed to shoot many of them down, but even a handful that get through can cause major damage and give Russia a new weapon of war.
Russia's military announced that its forces are withdrawing from a key city in southern Ukraine, a major new blow to its war effort. Moscow said it is retreating from Kherson on the west bank of the Dnieper River as Ukrainian forces advance in the area. Russian state TV broadcast the decision in a conversation between its top general in Ukraine and the defense minister.
Kherson and nearby settlements cannot be properly supplied or function. People's lives are in constant danger. The enemy is firing indiscriminately at the city. At present, all those who wanted to, more than 115,000 people, have left this area.
Officials in Kyiv suggested that any Russian retreat could actually be a trap to lure in Ukrainian forces.
More than a dozen drone strikes knocked out energy infrastructure across southern Ukraine today. Officials say Russia is to blame for the attacks in Odessa, Kherson, and Mykolaiv. Ukraine's military says the drones were Iranian-made and that 10 of them were shot down before they hit their targets. It marks the latest in Russia's unrelenting assault on the country's energy grid and civilian housing. Millions of people are still without heat, light, and clean water.
President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine is in Washington this evening, a surprise visit to his nation's most important partner in its fight against Russia. He met this afternoon with President Biden and will address Congress later tonight. The visit comes as lawmakers consider major funding increase for Ukraine and as the Biden administration sends more weapons to aid the war effort. In a visit the world is watching, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled outside the borders of his battered country for his first known trip abroad since Russia invaded in February.
Well, Mr. President, it's good to have you back.
His decision to come to Washington on day 301 of the war reinforces the partnership between the U.S. and Ukraine that Zelensky sees as critical. On Twitter, he said he would meet with President Biden to, quote, strengthen resilience and defense capabilities of Ukraine. He took that same message Tuesday to Ukrainian troops in the city of Bakhmut, the site of pitched and brutal fighting in the east.
It is a complicated situation. The enemy increases the number of its troops. We will pass on gratitude from our boys to the U.S. Congress and U.S. President for their support, but it is not enough.
Ukrainians reacted to news of Zelensky's visit, trusting their leader to secure what the country needs.
We hope for support as the United States is one of our main partners. After his trip to Bakhmut, which is my home city, I hope Zelensky will be able to share his first-hand experience about what's going on there, how our cities are being ruined, how our people are being killed. I think no one in the U.S. can remain careless, and that support will only grow.
Russia has hammered Ukraine with missiles and drone strikes in recent weeks as Moscow shifted its strategy to inflict even more pain on Ukraine's people, repeatedly taking down the electrical grid amid freezing winter cold. But more air defense is on its way. The U.S. announced today that it would provide an additional $1.8 billion in military aid to Ukraine, with, for the first time, a Patriot missile battery and precision-guided bombs for fighter jets. With those, the U.S. aims to help Ukraine bolster both its air defense and attack capabilities. Meanwhile, Russia sent a stark warning against further American military aid to Ukraine.
Weapons supplies continue. The assortment of supplied weapons is expanding. All this leads to an aggravation of the conflict and does not bode well for Ukraine.
And in a speech to top military leaders, Russia's President Vladimir Putin vowed to continue the war no matter what.
Of course, combat and military actions always bring tragedy and human losses. But since it is inevitable, it is better that it happens today than tomorrow. I have no doubt that all the goals we set ourselves will be achieved.
All my appreciations from my heart, from the hearts of Ukrainians, all Ukrainians.
Back at the White House, Zelensky thanked the U.S. for support and presented President Biden with a medal won by a Ukrainian officer, given at the officer's request. Later, standing side by side with Zelensky, President Biden said the new aid package would send a powerful message to Putin.
He was wrong, wrong, and wrong. He continues to be wrong. The sooner he makes it clear that he cannot possibly win this war, that's when the time we have to put this president in a position to be able to decide how he wants the war to end.
They spoke about weapons, energy sanctions, and support for peace talks. Zelensky urged the U.S. to stay engaged in the war and in its support of Ukraine.
We really fight for our common victory against this tyranny. That is real life. And we will win. And I really want win together. Thanks so much. Not want, sorry, I'm sure.
His last stop is his first in-person address to Congress, where he will ask lawmakers not to forget about Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky returned to Ukraine today. Yesterday, he met with President Biden at the White House, and he received thunderous applause during his address to Congress. Meanwhile, this week, the Russians announced plans to beef up their military and to double down on the war effort. Jeff Bennett has that story.
Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu today visited Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine. He inspected the soldiers' canteen and dormitories, and he walked through the fields where the Russians are waging war. Before leaving, his final message was clear: everything is fine. But in a speech to his military chiefs yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin admitted shortcomings.
We need to improve the system of military recruitment offices. We will continue to equip our strategic forces with the latest types of weapons.
Putin also pledged to modernize the military, and yesterday stopped to survey Moscow's newest weapons, including surveillance drones. Russia plans a 30% expansion of its armed forces and wants to form new and bigger units. Meantime, Russian troops have lost ground in Ukraine. Ukrainian troops this year reclaimed more than half the territory Russia has taken. Moscow's recent focus is in the east, in Donetsk, where the city of Bakhmut has sustained a relentless attack.
They have been attacking it day and night, but Bakhmut stands.
In his historic speech to a joint meeting of Congress last night, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Americans for their support as he called for more weapons.
Your money is not charity. It's an investment in the global security.
The U.S. has announced an additional $1.8 billion in military aid to Ukraine. The new package includes a Patriot missile battery, its most advanced air defense weapon. Today, President Putin downplayed the weapon's capabilities.
With regards to Patriots, it's a rather old system.
But in a video addressed to his nation, President Zelensky said his trip to Washington was a success.
We are coming with good results, ones that will help. The victory will be ours.
Today, Moscow said a Ukrainian attack over the weekend in Russian-occupied Donetsk killed at least 60 soldiers, making it one of the deadliest incidents for Russia in 10 months of war. And in the early hours of this morning, Russia launched one of its largest barrages of drone strikes on Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. Ukraine says it shot down nearly all of them. But as Nick Schifrin reports, it's been a violent beginning to a new year of war in Ukraine.
In a nation at war, war does not take a holiday. And so over New Year's, Ukrainian rockets destroyed this building housing Russian troops. And for 3 days straight, Russia terrorized Kyiv from the sky. At least 60 drones targeted Ukraine's capital. Some eluded Ukrainian air defenses. The targets were yet again civilian, ripping open this hotel, damaging the apartments of some of Kyiv's most vulnerable, and destroying families in their homes. This used to be the Kaharylitsky's kitchen. A Russian missile landed a direct hit, killing 36-year-old Irina. 2 days later, Serhiy looks for pieces of the weapon that killed her. He mourns his wife and embraces their son, who's lost his mother. His 73-year-old father, Anatoly, was injured in the same explosion.
You know, we were building this house for 5-6 years with our salary, with our money, and this happens. What can I say? They are beasts. They are not human.
And yet, amidst the torment, there is tenacity. Ukrainians in Kyiv managed to celebrate New Year's, hoping for the total victory that, despite all the fear of 10 months ago, President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed to achieve in his New Year's address.
It was dark. It was loud. It was hard for many and scary for some. 311 days have passed. It can still be dark, loud, and complicated for us. But we will definitely never be afraid again.
And yet he acknowledged the country's pain, written on the face of little girls who watched his address as their family marked a new year. But Zelensky claimed, as Abraham Lincoln did 160 years ago after Gettysburg, that war has created a new nation.
We woke up on February 24th into another life, being another people, another Ukrainians. On February 24th, millions of us made a choice. Not a white flag, but a blue and yellow flag. Not escaping, but meeting. Meeting the enemy.
Simultaneously on Russian TV, President Vladimir Putin delivered his own message and claimed historical truth is on Russia's side.
This has been a year of difficult, necessary decisions, of crucial steps towards Russia's full sovereignty and the powerful consolidation of our society.
He posed with troops and once again blamed the war on the West.
They cynically use Ukraine and its people to weaken and divide Russia. We have never allowed anyone to do that, and we will not allow anyone to do that.
And so the war goes on. The front line is 700 miles long, and there is endless destruction in a war without rest. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
For the first time today, the U.S. announced it will send American tanks to Ukraine as part of a coordinated announcement with Germany, which will also send its tanks.
It's a shift in U.S. policy and one of the most significant weapons upgrades that Ukraine has been asking for. Nick Schifrin starts our coverage.
Ukraine calls them the critical weapon systems to recapture its own territory, Western tanks. And today, the U.S. pledged 31 M1 Abrams tanks. And Germany approved the export of nearly 100 Leopard 2 tanks. President Biden at the White House.
Ukrainians are fighting an age-old battle against aggression and domination. It's a battle Americans have fought proudly, time and again. And it's a battle we're going to make sure the Ukrainians are well equipped to fight as well.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Berlin.
There really is a war going on in Europe, not far away from here. That's why we do what is necessary and possible to support Ukraine, but at the same time avoid an escalation between Russia and NATO.
Germany's announcement allows a half-dozen European countries to send their German-made Leopard tanks. The goal is to create 2 battalions for a few thousand Ukrainian soldiers in the next 2 to 3 months. It will be a major upgrade to Ukraine's mostly Soviet-era armor that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today called a historic achievement.
We have to form a fist of tanks, a fist of freedom, which will not allow tyranny to rise again.
Germany's announcement mends a European rift exposed by Poland and others' anger over Germany's prior resistance.
The Germans are defending themselves against this like a devil protects himself against holy water.
German officials said they were waiting to send a new capacity to Ukraine until the U.S. took the step with them.
It is right that we didn't let ourselves be driven, and that we instead counted and will continue to count on close cooperation for such an issue.
It's been very clear that the German government does not want to take a major step that they fear may be a cause of escalating the war without the United States.
Heather Conley is the president of the German Marshall Fund. She says German fears of escalation and the legacy of German Nazi tanks overrunning European cities during World War II led Berlin to hesitate.
This is a historically difficult moment for the Germans to be sending tanks back into that theater. Again, they feel stronger and more capable when the U.S. is standing right beside them as they take that step.
The U.S. took the step with them, even though it had called the Abrams tank unsustainable for Ukraine as recently as Friday on the NewsHour.
The challenge with the Abrams is it's expensive, it's difficult to train on, it is very difficult to sustain, it has a huge complicated turbine engine that requires jet fuel.
None of these excuses were compelling, and that's what they were.
Retired General Ben Hodges is the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He argues the time frame announced today to deliver Abrams in months, perhaps a year, isn't fast enough.
I'm disappointed because the amount of time it took to get to this decision, and then the way that the decision is going to be implemented does not convey a sense of urgency that the administration wants Ukraine to win anytime soon.
Did it have a choice? Could the U.S. have gone faster?
Of course, we always have a choice. If you want me to win, I'm going to take the closest tanks I've got, which is a brigade's worth of M1s that are in storage here on the ground in Europe.
That's nearly 90 tanks that Hodges says could be deployed within weeks.
Get Ukrainian troops on those Abrams tanks that are parked in Europe right now. Let them train, do gunnery, practice the tactics, and then put them on trains and send them to the front.
That front may prove Ukraine's biggest challenge yet. In the last 4 months, Ukraine has recaptured some territory in the east and in the south. But east of the Dnipro River, Russian forces have been digging in. Recapturing that occupied territory will require a lot of firepower. That's why the U.S. and European priority is the Leopards.
They could play a key role if they get there in the next 2 or 3 months.
It's been nearly a year since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And today, for the first time, the United States labeled Russia's actions there as crimes against humanity. The war stands at a crossroads. Both Moscow and Kyiv hope to gain momentum in the coming weeks. Nick Schifrin is in Kramatorsk, Ukraine, near the front line. Nick's reporting in Ukraine is supported by the Pulitzer Center.
1,100 miles from the front, Vice President Harris today detailed Russian crimes and called for accountability.
Russian forces have pursued a widespread and systemic attack against a civilian population. Gruesome acts of murder, torture, rape, and deportation.
Among her examples of crimes against humanity, a Russian strike on a Mariupol theater that killed hundreds of women and children as they hid. And the Russian massacre and mass graves of Bucha. Ukraine has gone a step further and accused Russia of genocide. That was a word repeated today in Munich by Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who also predicted the West would go further than it's been willing on weapons and send jets.
I will take a risk of saying that Ukraine will receive planes. It's a matter of time and procedure.
But that's time Ukrainian soldiers don't have. They're barely holding Bakhmut, the epicenter of the fighting. Much of the city has been abandoned or destroyed, and Russians are closing in on 3 sides.
I don't have any emotions in this war. I treat it as my job. For me to execute a shot is the same as sending a piece of mail. There are no emotions whatsoever.
And that's the sense from all the soldiers I speak to. Whenever I ask them if they've lost men, they've lost friends, they each tear up and ask me to change the subject. War is overwhelming in so many ways, but these soldiers out here know they don't have time to mourn. John, the fact is that the fiercest fighting may be yet to come.
President Biden has arrived in Poland tonight after making an unannounced visit to Kyiv, just days ahead of the 1-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The administration says it informed Moscow before Biden arrived. This marks the first visit by a U.S. president to Ukraine in 14 years. With the support of the Pulitzer Center, Nick Schifrin reports from Kyiv.
At the end of a 5,000-mile journey, the commander-in-chief visited a capital at war to provide an embattled country a show of solidarity.
We're here to stay.
On the right, the leader who 1 year ago refused a U.S. offer to evacuate, wearing trademark olive drab. On the left, the leader who became Ukraine's most important supporter, wearing a tie striped with Ukraine's national colors.
I'm here to show our unwavering support for the nation's independence, their sovereignty, and territorial integrity.
The administration today called President Biden's visit unprecedented in modern times to a war zone without a significant U.S. military presence. Russia launched its full-scale invasion 361 days ago. President Biden remembered it seemed dire.
1 year ago, the world was literally at the time bracing for the fall of Kyiv, perhaps even the end of Ukraine. You know, 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands, democracy stands, the Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. Kyiv has captured a part of my heart, I must say.
We can and we must ensure that 2023 becomes the year of victory, with the liberation of Ukrainian land from Russian occupation, with solid guarantees of long-term security of our country, Europe, and the entire world.
But while the U.S. today announced another $500 million package of weapons transfers, it did not include long-range weapons that Zelensky once again requested.
Such an important package is an unmistakable signal that Russian revenge attempts would have no chance.
The U.S. informed Moscow of Biden's travel, but still, Moscow scrambled jets, triggering Ukraine's air raid sirens. It came during a visit to St. Michael's Cathedral, which became a sanctuary during the 2014 protests known as the Revolution of Dignity. On this date every year, Ukraine remembers the more than 100 protesters killed 9 years ago, helping evict a pro-Russian president. Today, Biden and Zelensky remembered the more than 4,500 soldiers killed since then fighting Russia.
Thank you for letting me come back.
Inside, Zelensky and Biden met with Orthodox Church of Ukraine leaders who've helped forge an independent religious identity distinct from Russia. And even in a country at war, there was time for a quiet moment.
This was the scene outside during that portion of the visit. This is as close as we could get, about 600 or 700 feet away. There was unprecedented security here in the center of Kyiv. This is usually a bustling street.
The city's center was locked down and mobile and internet service cut off around Biden. The presidential convoy drove quickly through empty streets. Biden is no stranger to Kyiv. He visited some of these same sites back in 2014 after Russia's initial invasion. But his trip today, right before a sad milestone, was the trip Zelensky and his team wanted most.
Freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes, and that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.